Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Teens for Business. I'm your host Ivan.
I'm Kywin.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Jackie.
Thank you so much for joining us today. In this episode, we'll be talking about the global domination of shared bikes and the economics surrounding this feat. So, just in context, the phenomenon of shared bikes arose originally in Beijing, China in 2014 by a brand called OFO, and they were all over the place. If you went to China before the pandemic, basically you would see like at least three or four different share bike brands all over the streets, and they were being well used. Like a lot of people use them, really easy to use, very cheap. Additionally, but however, the pandemic did do a number on these companies, and OFO, the company that started this share bike business model, went defunct in 2020. Um, but in the USA, they also share bikes have also risen up, especially in college campuses. Um, and there's also, I remember near my school, there is this share bike by Ford, I think. And let's just say it's not really popular. It hasn't really taken off in the USA, although it still exists. Um, so what do you guys think? What is your general perception of share bikes, and what do you think can be improved to kind of regenerate demand, especially in the US?
I think I really like the concept of shared bikes because A, it's a lot better for the environment. B, it's easier for the people because you don't need to own specifically a bike and keep that everywhere with you, or park it and make sure it's not gonna get stolen, things like that. So I like the concept of it. I think it's also interesting. I think Lyft had some program where they also have shared bikes. So I think definitely companies are trying to promote this shared bike concept. It's just that people aren't really catching on. And I think a lot of that is because like you mentioned, Ivan, Beijing, that's like a really, really big city. And so my family is from Shanghai, China, and I see that a lot too because Shanghai is also a really big city and driving is going to take you so long because of traffic. But then in the United States, it's like a little bit less populated or densely populated than some of the bigger cities in China. And so it's a lot more difficult to bike. Like if me to Costco right now, like I drive, that's maybe 10, 15 minutes, not a big deal. But then if I were to take a bike, I can't go on the highway. That's just, I think, dangerous, right? And I would have to go on a more local way and then bike all the way over, and that just takes way too long. So I think because of the way the infrastructure, the way the way people are set over in the United States is a big role on why shared bikes and just biking as a whole isn't as popular as it would be in, like Ivan said, China.
Yeah, I agree. I think for shared bikes, I personally haven't really used shared bikes because I live in the suburbs of Chicago. I know Chicago has a shared bike system, but it hasn't really taken off. There's shared bike stations that have a lot of shared bikes that aren't really used. But I also think that there's a lot of outside factors that also control this demand, like weather. You can't. I don't think anyone would really want to bike outside when there's raining or thunderstorms, and also big conditions like the pandemic. We're gonna get into this later, but in the pandemic, if you shared bike, you're gonna get risk that the person who used the bike before had COVID. So it it's just not safe to use it in those situations, and that's why the demand is a little bit lower because a lot of outside aspects can affect it. And there are I think a lot of ways for these shared bikes to rebound in the future, maybe higher technology, higher tech, just generally higher technology, more technological innovation, and I guess just stronger lock systems, just make sure nobody steals them. I'm not too sure how it really works, but there's probably a lot of technology improvements that can be made to make it more firm and make demand stronger.
Yeah, I think that they're definitely a good idea because in terms of if you're in a big city and you're like a college kid or something, you don't have a car obviously because it's like this is a big city and you want to get around. There's shared bikes. It's also scooters, I think Lime scooters, where you can just ride around and get around instead of yeah, just these things that help help keep our environment, keeps our environment clean, and it also it's a lot easier than like, yeah, like Jackie said, like owning a bike and having to bring it anywhere, where the whole city can basically use these shared bikes. I think it is a good idea, but there are definitely like things that you have to consider when thinking about like how people can use these.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all the points presented here. And like Jackie mentioned, it is especially dangerous to bike in cities in the US because a lot of US cities are generally not bike friendly. Like in the Bay Area, I know Kyron can attest to this. Riding a bike is scary. Like you have to share the road, and like it's like super scary if you ever like rode a bike around our area. And like I know things like bigger cities like New York might be a little bit better, but in general, it's just like super scary to bike alongside cars. But opposed to cities in China where share bikes took off, they have like a dedicated bike lane. There's a barrier. Like there's nothing to be afraid of. Like there's not going to be a car going to crash into you. It's going to be have to be deliberate for them to crash into you. And as opposed to in the US where anybody really can crash into you. So that's I think one of the reasons why share bikes didn't really take off. And in addition to that, I think um, ShareBikes itself is really risky model because people are generally really poor at treating public equipment. And like, I don't know if you guys have seen photos of it, but like in China, you can see like share bikes just piled up in front of buildings by people just riding them there, just throwing them into a pile. And like they're just generally mistreated so much. And this kind of goes to my next point, which is how is this different from electric scooters, which have taken off in the US in a lot of big cities, especially where we live, where in the Bay Area. And like since I'm also went to Baltimore this weekend and saw a ton of these Lime and Bird scooters, although in varying sorts of conditions. So what do you guys think these electric scooters have taken off instead of share bikes?
Yeah, I think that's actually really interesting because you would think that, like same conceptually, it's something in between a car and like walking. But I think it's also the thing of like scooters, in my opinion, are a little bit more, I don't want to say user friendly, but they kind of are. They're a little bit more self-explainable. I think most people do know how to ride a bike, but that level of like difficulty of like, okay, do I really want to ride a bike with cars? Like, what if I just, go over a rock, like I don't know if I trust myself with a bike. Like, versus a scooter, it's like you stand on a scooter, you just kind of go, right? And I think that is pretty different. And also what I've seen, I don't know if this is like different for other cities, but with electric scooters, you kind of share the lane with human beings. And that's maybe not so great for the humans walking, but it's better for the scooter person, right? Like instead of being with the cars and then you getting hit, the biggest thing that might happen to you is like accidentally kind of bumping into a human a little bit, but you're also not going at that fast of a speed. So in terms of like dangerousness, it's I think a little bit better. So like that ease of just safety is probably a really big factor. And some people don't know how to ride bikes, like I said, or they're not super comfortable with sharing a lane with cars. And so having those electric scooters, that just like gets it all out of the way for you. Like you don't need to worry about, oops, is a car going to hit me from behind? Or am I going to accidentally fall over to the side? Things like that. But I think, another thing with shared bikes is that versus regular bikes is that some people in my neighborhood, at least, it's like they bike for fun, like bike for exercise, but you don't do that with a shared bike, or it's less popular to do with a shared bike. So all of the benefits of bikes kind of disappear a little bit if you're doing it for exercise and for fun. So that's also probably why it's not like as popular.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that like some people might think that like biking is like a little bit like more fit effort like physically, that their like legs need to be like a lot more like powerful to like get like to like a long distance with like a bike like in a city. So I think that electric scooters are just going off the point that they're like more user friendly. I think they require a little bit like less effort to like move around. And I overall I just think that like I I did see like a lot of like scooters like in Baltimore. I think they are like user friendly. Like when it comes to like a lot of like sidewalks, they take up less space, which could like really help compared to like bikes, which are a little bit bigger. And I feel like scooters are like just like more secure.
Yeah, I also agree with that. I personally like I've seen I actually haven't seen that many shared bikes around. I maybe saw like once in the city in San Francisco. But I actually like near California, I haven't seen that many shared bikes, but I've seen like Lime scooters like almost everywhere. And I think it's because it's like a little bit more accessible for people. And safety is a major factor, especially in the city. There's like so many cars, and yeah, just like scooters. Right now, as of right now, there's definitely more shared scooters than shared bikes. I think it's just way more popular for people to use right now.
Yeah, definitely. It's just electric bikes in general are just much more popular, especially in the US. And I haven't ridden one, but one of my few of my friends who did ride one did say they were especially scary to ride on because they go extremely fast for their size. Um, but I don't think that's a really big problem, especially like once or twice you get used to it. But also, like I just want to mention, like when we went to Baltimore, I have this photo of one of my friends just pointing at this one, the few electric scooters just thrown into the bay. Um, so that's a really big problem, especially in big cities. Like this goes on to share bikes as well, but since electric scooters are a bigger thing here, like a lot of teenagers, like there's been trends online where they like just do really dumb things with these electric scooters, such as throwing them into the water, piling up into a mountain, or like just pushing them, like driving them all the way up to a mountain so that nobody can use them, like stuff like that. And I know like the companies do have lawyers and stuff to prevent this and make sure they don't financially suffer from dumb trends. Um, but that's just a really big problem in the US, especially with electric scooters, although they are doing really well. These companies are really popular and the scooters do seem to work well if they're not in the water. Okay, so move on to the next point of discussion is how do you think the pandemic affected share bikes and led to its demise? And why do you think according like electric scooters here didn't really happen before the pandemic. Like it was really small, but after the pandemic, something got really big. So why did we see like a drop off with share bikes during the pandemic, but like a rise in electric scooters after the pandemic?
I think it's kind of like a combination of effects. One of the biggest things is probably like the thing of culture and popularity. Like if something falls off and another thing becomes really popular, most people who don't like if they're like fine either way, they're just gonna go off with like whatever is more accessible, whatever is more commonly used. And so like once a trend starts, especially with things like this, it's like, okay, I'll like, use something like that. Like I'll use a scooter instead of a bike. Okay, I'll just go with that. The same way like Uber and Lyft, they're like kind of the more dominant ones. And people are like, okay, I'm gonna go with whatever is popular right now. And like those two are the most popular ones instead of like some other app for like sharing drives like that. So I don't know. I think it's like really just different in terms of like culture and how people just like jump in with whatever it's like most popular. Um I don't also I also saw this thing on TikTok one day and it was basically about like this dude riding a scooter. And it's kind of funny, but the point was that like he was trying to advertise using a scooter. Like it wasn't a paid promotion, but it was like, oh my God, guys, this is like actually really cool, like really fun. And I think like once you kind of start having those videos pop up and once it becomes like more trendy or so, I think it's like it really starts to go off and all align like that. And like to your point about the pandemic, it's I think like that just kind of stopped people from there wasn't a need to go out as much. So like bikes wasn't necessary. Like where are you going to bike to if we're in a pandemic? Like the grocery store that's like downstairs. Like what's happening with that? So
Yeah, I agree. Definitely, I've seen like a lot of more like videos of like scooters being advertised rather than like shared bikes and just bikes in general. So a lot of people have jumped on the scooter trend. They I'm not sure if the facts back this, but I do think an electric scooter is faster than a bike. I'm not too sure if that's right, but compared to like a bike, electric scooter definitely is less effort. So people probably want to do like things with like less effort that can get to like a similar result or a better result. And also like based like how the pandemic affected like the dominance like of the bikes, shared bikes. Definitely the pandemic like really like made a huge dent into his dominance because like well there's a pandemic, people want to like stay home, and plus shared bikes like there's always a risk that the I talked about this earlier, there's always a risk that the person using it before could have some like have COVID or any like other like dangerous like pathogen that you don't want to get. So I think that like just like improve this like on the future, like there should be like something to like address this like problem, and like not since there wasn't really a solution to address this problem with shared bikes, that's also like one of the reasons why it is not as popular as it is today.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think pandemic, just people weren't really outside going places, and that like these shared bikes and scooters, they all require people like traveling around the city, going to different places, right? And so I think for like that period of time where everything was just shut down, like this stuff probably wasn't almost used at all. So um definitely as people like have built the habit of not using it, there's gonna be less and less people wanting to use shared bikes and shared scooters. But I think as we as like time progresses and we're like moving farther and farther away from the pandemic, I think it's really gonna like there's gonna be more people using it. There's always people, more and more people going to the big city, and whenever on college campuses, big cities, there's definitely gonna be people that need to get places that don't want to drive a car. So I feel like, yeah, I definitely feel like these bikes are they're gonna probably grow in demand in the future.
Yeah, I just want to add like I think people take rent, whatever you call it, these electric scooters, bird lime scooters, they rent it to have fun more than to get to some place because the places where the scooters are found are very erratic. Like one day is here and another day is gone. So I think people ride these scooters not like share bikes where you're actually getting place to place, but like as more of a method like, hey, I want to go there, but suddenly there's this electric bike. I want to have some fun, you know? So I think that also might have contributed a little bit to the rise of the electric scooter after the pandemic because it was just this fun that we didn't have really during the pandemic. But since the share bike has really fallen off the face of the earth, but now the share bikes are not pure bikes. They are more hybrid. Like they have a battery, just like much like the electric scooters. Thinking about like the Ford bike share bike station near my school. Uh, those bikes are battery powered. So they are like kind of you can't just throw them around. You have to drive them to a station in order to get off. So do you see kind of a future for this kind of share bikes or in general the business model, especially with having the new type of share bike with electricity, with batteries where you have to return to a specific point? Is there like a kind of a future for these kind of models?
I think that's a really interesting question, considering that it's debatable whether shared bikes even have a future, especially with their competition. But I think it's like on the company side, it really makes a lot of sense because by making it so that you have to have a battery charge, you kind of ensure that the person or like a regular upstanding citizen who uses them is going to return them to their, like their supposed place. And so like it really makes sense on that side point, but also it's kind of a little bit inconvenient because let's say like you want to go somewhere, but then like you live a little bit far from where you're supposed to return it to, and that's just annoying. Like it's like a triangle you're setting up for yourself. Like that's where you want to go, but this is where you have to return your bike, and you still have to like walk or some other method of transportation to get back to where you live. And then to solve that, that means the company has to have more of those little stations, I guess, in order to make sure that A, the bikes are actually getting returned, and B, the customer doesn't have to walk like a whole mile to return their bike. So I think that's like a little bit difficult to implement. Might be a lot easier in the city, but if you're in a more suburban place like where I live, it becomes a little bit difficult because you have to make sure that the person is close enough that they're actually willing to return the bike and not have to walk a really far distance from home. Because like especially with bikes, like Ivan said, they're more for like work methods or like for an actual purpose. But if you like come home from work and then you're like, oh, I have to like return my bike, walk home for 1.5 miles from the bike stop, that's just a lot of work. And at that point, people are like, I'll just take some other method of transportation. So
Yeah, I agree. I think the future of like these bikes is like really hard. It's like really up in the air because obviously electric scooters and their recent like success has like really blown up over the past few years. Even like with the new design of the new bikes, like it's still like this the electric scooters are still leaving the shared bike in a little bit of a shadow. So I think there, as long as there's like some sort of like a demand change, which could happen with like new technology, new systems, maybe like a new different like type of like implementation of new bikes. I definitely can see there like being a new sort of use for these bikes and potentially a new future. But I feel like with like the current like competition with the electric scooters make it really, really, really hard. And obviously, just in both of these systems, electric scooters and shared bikes, there's a lot of outside factors that really affect that. And I talked about that like at the very beginning, like the weather could affect it, like different like crises, like recently in Philly, like the bad air quality may like reduce demand to like go out. So there's like a lot of outside factors that affect both of like these like systems. And with the recent rise of like the shares the electric scooters and like and I don't know how the companies plan to like market like the bikes, but it's gonna take like a lot for them to like have like a sort of like a marketing plan that's like more impressive than the scooters that will like make people like switch over. But like I think there's a little bit of a future, but it's not gonna be that much. And it's really easy for like the electric scooters to like keep improving and leave the shared bikes in like a hole for the future.
Yeah, I agree. I think shared, but it's just like it's still pretty hard. I outside of like city areas and like we talked about like the stations that we're trying to implement, it's like why like if they use these bikes to like get from place to place. So if you have to return it to the station, how are you gonna get back to where you actually need to be? So it's a lot of logistics with this, and yeah, like unforeseen circumstances, like with the bad air quality in different places, or like another major health outbreak. I know it's like very unlikely, but like it's like still like because something like shared bikes that's not like very extremely well established right now, there could be a future, but it's still going to be pretty hard for it to like grow significantly in demand and people using them.
Yeah, definitely, because the business model kind of relies on people um to be good humans instead of the people they actually are, which is throwing stuff around and not caring about the products. As seen by people throwing bird scooters into the water, and like just not one, like at least five or six. Um, and like so this kind of like I know that share bikes, they make the bikes a specific quality. Like it can't be too good to steal, but it also can't be too bad to not use. So it's like kind of a sweet spot where it's too bad to steal but good enough to use. And that's kind of like their product to make sure their thing can stay alive. And I think that's a really big obstacle to tackle to find that sweet point, because you obviously want your product to be good, but also you don't want your product to be stolen off the streets, which kind of hurts your revenue a little bit. So talking about this business, like this sharing concept. So how can we expand upon this concept to make it, kind of useful in today's world? As you can see, shared bikes have fallen off, but instead shared scooters are seeing their heyday. Like I don't see them going away anytime soon. So how should we expand? Is there any good ideas that are expand upon this concept that you guys think these companies should incorporate?
I think a lot of it has to do with, again, culture, and that in turn is about good marketing, good branding, things like that. Because shared bikes, it's not like a new testing concept. Like it has already been proven to work in some areas of the world. Like we said, China, the big cities in China. And so it does work in some areas. And so if companies were able to kind of figure out logistics a little bit more, things like that, because also what I've noticed, just my personal experience, is that when you go back to China, or if you go to like the big cities where shared bikes are more popular, they're, from my experience at least, they're not like electronic bikes. They're just like regular old bikes, but they're like painted in the brand colors. They're not anything super special. So I think that's kind of the thing about, like, you don't need to specifically have it in like a charging station. It's a lot more accessible, because building a station where you just hang your bikes up, or like you just lock them in, versus a whole charging station, that's difficult, that's more expensive to build. So once you get past that logistic, that's, I think, easier. Again, also comes with marketing too. Like if you're able to convince your customers, like, it's good for your health, it's good for the environment, isn't that a win-win for all of us? Like if you're able to do that, then that's like, step one, kind of like, to convince your customers that, or your potential customers, that that's a good idea and like they would benefit from it. Because even though electric scooters are super popular right now, they're almost like kind of a trend, and it's hard to imagine, like, I don't know, like a 30-year-old going to work in New York City being like, yes, I'm going to use a scooter from 10 years ago. Like that just doesn't really seem realistic. Almost, it feels like a trend, like something people are like hopping on, but it doesn't seem to be sustainable in that sense, because it's almost like Jack said, it was like recreational. You're not really using it for an actual purpose. So I think a lot of it is with marketing and how the brand decides to wrap it up.
I do definitely agree with the point that culture and marketing is the main factor which is affecting the demand. Like, first of all, like scooters have been using a huge rise because a lot of people are using TikTok to like just flex their scooter skills or something. It's become a little bit of a big trend, and that's exactly what Jackie's just described. Also, I think even with like the recent technology improvements with the bikes, like they're now becoming electric or battery powered, like it's still like hasn't received too much of a possibility. I mean it still hasn't received like a lot of like attention, and like compared to like what it was like before and what people want it to be. So definitely more effective marketing is definitely needed for the bikes. I think just going onward in the future, it's gonna be like really hard to like, because like the cost of building like stations are like really high, and since like the technologies of the bikes are changing, like which will also like increase a lot of costs. So I really feel like just to like go forward with the concept of shared bikes, shared scooters, I think it really just like depends on what the how the culture will shift in like different areas over like the next few years. And then like I think companies and firms can use this, like the trends, to like market better and hit like a really good deal, and maybe help the shared bikes recover. Yeah, I'm gonna be honest, it's gonna be a little bit hard for them to do that, but I think it's still possible, and we'll just see what the future holds for the shared bikes and the companies that run shared bikes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just there's maybe a possibility, like for people that like use shared bikes and scooters a lot, they could set up like different membership systems for them like throughout a year. And then it's just like the whole system of it is still like pretty hard though. I think they can definitely expand in the future, but as for right now, like we talked about, like the having to return them to like a station if they don't have that many stations, then it's like you basically need to build many stations within a city where people have that accessibility of going from the station to wherever they want to go. And that's the way that they can do that. That's going to cost money. They need more and more people using these bikes. And right now there's currently like the demand isn't that high for bikes, especially. So yeah, there's definitely many things wrong with that needs to change for these bikes to be more successful. But I definitely think there's a chance that they can expand in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Just adding on to all of these thoughts that I think they should market probably these as an alternate form of public transportation, especially in, like big cities. Or not big cities. Big city public transportation is like decent, like usable, but like especially where places where like Taiwan and I live, right? In the Bay Area, we don't really have a form of public transit. Even though it exists, it's not good enough to use. The cars are just simply superior. But maybe like in those sort of scenarios, we can market these kind of like a alternate form of public transportation where like you get to exercise in, as like Jackie was saying, and like it also adds like an aspect of fun, especially with like electric scooters or even electric bikes, if that continues to be a thing. Like it adds an aspect of fun, whereas in like sitting in a bus doesn't really have, right? So I think that's probably something these business models probably should think about adding on. But just going on to some takeaways from our discussion today, but definitely we can definitely see why the shared bikes model business model has kind of fallen off recently, mainly due to like the pandemic because consumer demand suddenly dropped off and they couldn't financially recover from that. But we can also see like a new form of this sharing model from electric scooters. Although there are more things to improve upon, but it's definitely growing a growing market, and I can't see it declining anytime soon.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. One of my biggest takeaways was when we mentioned like why specifically there was a shift from electric, shared bikes as a whole to electric scooters. And I think the points that were brought up and like why this shift occurred was really interesting, especially because they kind of are used for different purposes. Like you don't really see a 9 to 5 employee going like, okay, I'm going to use my electric scooter today. Like, that's not really a long-term thing. It's more for fun or like more for, I'm going to try it out. Or, it's not really every single day how I commute to work kind of thing. But I think the point that electric scooters are a little bit more fun in the sense that they're almost new, right? Like bikes have been around for a long time. People know what bikes are, like it's always been there. But electric scooters to even though like scooters, they have been around the scene for quite some time, but this concept of electric scooter is much more new compared to bikes or even electric bikes. So, like that kind of thing is really like makes it fun, makes it a trend for people. And that is what brings them in. It's like, oh, like my friends are all doing this. Let me try this out. Like, hey, it's kind of fun. I also don't have to do anything except for stand on it. And it takes me to where I want to go. And I don't have to worry about, unfortunately having some accident with a car. Right. And so, safety, recreation, trend, like all those come together. And there kind of really isn't a good, there probably are, but the reasons of why to not use it for like a one-time thing at least, or like, for fun, like the reasons are kind of small. And I think we also touched upon this too, but the fact that they are kind of a trend, I'm really interested to see how the trend of electric scooters go. Like if they're still going to be super popular in the future, are they going to be just a trend that dies off really quickly, and then those companies with electric scooters become like those of shared bikes right now? What happens with them? So I think that's something to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, I agree. My biggest takeaway is like how really big like this cultural effect really, it's like similar to Jackie's, but it's like how big really this cultural effect really has on like the shared bikes. Like the pandemic really like made it like dented it in a hole. And then there's like these huge opportunities for like a shared bike, shared scooters to eventually rise up. Eventually shared scooters to take the lead a little bit with the effect of like marketing on TikTok, because I think to the people it just looked more exciting. And definitely like shared scooters, like like even though like tech is changing for both shared scooters and shared bikes, it hasn't really affected that much. Like even though the tech has changed for like shared bikes has they become like battery powered or they become like electric powered and like in replacement for like the standardized bikes, like standard bikes that we usually like ride in like the past decade or so. Like even though those like tech has like been added and implemented into like those shared bikes, the demand isn't really changing. In fact, like the demand is actually like, compared to like the demand of like electric scooters, the difference is like becoming greater. And that's because like the culture shift, like there's like the I feel just like the electric scooters just being like marketed better. So like just in the future, like there has to be like some like really good astute marketing that will really help that shared bike just like regain a little bit of like the of their market share and like just like the shared transportation. And definitely it will be a very interesting thing to keep an eye out in the future.
Yeah, I just think a takeaway for me is probably, yeah, like bikes still have a long way to go in comparison to how like popular scooters are right now. It's a lot of different aspects that play into that, like the safety of these bikes having to share the road with cars is an issue, and scooters are just a lot more accessible and like easy to move around even in a city. You think that like bikes you would get places faster, but scooters that people has just found them like more accessible. It's just like easier to use, and yeah, like there's definitely a future for these for shared bikes, but I think we're still pretty far from that right now.
Yeah, that definitely these points definitely show like how, as everyone said, this is the business model by itself is kind of problematic, but there's still a lot of potential that these companies probably haven't realized yet. But after all, thank you guys for tuning in into our episode on shared bikes and their business models today. And make sure to join us next week on the Teams for Business podcast for another interesting discussion.